As most of you know, Tropical Audubon is the oldest grassroots conservation organization in Dade County. We were founded 65 years ago in 1947. And during those 65 years, we've done a lot of work to try to protect our environment here. A few years ago, as a result of a planning effort, we decided that it was important for the conservation efforts of Tropical Audubon to get not only the word out, but more importantly, to be educated about what should be prioritized on our agenda. So as we work forward on the next year, what should be important to us is what's important to you in terms of conservation. So I hope you take today as an effort to educate us as to what we should be doing over the next year. I know as the chair, I hope to learn a lot, and I hope that education, filters to all of you. We look forward to hearing, in particular, from the various panels, but also the Q&A that's going to follow. I appreciate everyone giving up a Saturday. Gary Milano and I were talking, it's a beautiful Saturday. Rain is good. And we don't have a 100-mile-an-hour hurricane behind it. This is the kind of weather that supports South Florida. It makes the Everglades and Biscayne Bay and all those places that depend on fresh water a lot better place. So unlike what the weathermen say, this is a beautiful day. Anyway, welcome. I hope you enjoy today. I'd like to introduce the president of Tropical Audubon, Joe Barrows.
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you all for joining. I echo Dennis's welcome. And I happen to be wearing Tropical Audubon Society's 50th anniversary t-shirt right here. So we are on our 65th year. And again, I think we're have a lot of good things to do in the future and try to more or less represent what some great people have done at Tropical in the past. I wanted to mention one person in particular, John Ogden. It was 4 years ago, 3 to 4 years ago, that Dennis and John pressed to get the community up to date and involved in the environmental and conservation issues that confront South Florida. And so this workshop was born. As you know, our friend John Ogden passed away earlier this year after a brief but hard battle with cancer. His upbeat spirit and his love for life, the natural world, never faltered. John was a well-known scientist in South Florida and across the nation who dedicated himself to the Everglades restoration of our river of grass. John was awarded the Charles M. Brookfield Medal by Tropical Audubon Society back in 2004 for his many accomplishments. As you all probably can attest, John influenced all who came in contact with him. I'm proud to say that John was an active member of Tropical Audubon Society Board of Directors and co-chaired the Conservation Committee and instrumental in, again, bringing this workshop to where it is today. If you don't already know, John's life is going to be remembered by his friends and families on November 10th. And if you touch base with me a little later in the morning, we'll give you some more details if you don't know about those already. But we do definitely want to remember John Ogden. At any time we're looking to conserve our South Florida environment. So thank you. I do want to mention also Dennis Ollie, who shares John's passion for South Florida natural environment. Like John, Dennis is a fighter and also was awarded the Charles Brookfield Medal earlier this year at our annual meeting. As you already heard, Dennis heads our Conservation Committee and our conservation efforts. So I invite you all to continue what we're doing this morning and join TAS, Tropical Audubon Society, in our conservation efforts. Again, just to say a few other things. Speaking of fighters, Laura Reynolds, our executive director, I expect that you all know her, standing over here to my right. She's out there fighting every day for our South Florida environment, so I thank her for her hard work. And I'm sure she will mention later, but we've got a great group of interns. Tropical Audubon Society is definitely a very active group these days, and they help put this together. So we'll mention names later, but again, thank you, Dennis. Thank you, Laura, our interns, and thank you all for coming out this Saturday morning. Thank you.
I wanted to invite one of our sponsors up here, Jennifer Tishammer at the Deering Estate, to say a few words.
So thank you very much for selecting the Deering Estate at Cutler for this wonderful annual workshop. We have a long-term relationship with the Tropical Audubon Society, so we're very thankful that each and every one of you is here today. I just wanted to extend a general invitation along with that thank you in that we are starting a number of new programs here on the estate. We have been growing unbelievably in the last 4 to 5 years in terms of attendance, recognition, specifically our environmental education programs, and as it relates to specific areas of interest, adding to bird research, our citizen science projects that we have. Any of you who are interested in getting involved, participating more, helping us with some of those conservation issues or creating awareness amongst our audiences or our shared audiences, please, sometime today, grab my business card. I love to sit down and have a conversation. Weather permitting, we will be giving a tour this afternoon of the Cutler Slough Rehydration Project, where I'll talk about a lot of those shared mission and interest that hopefully we can work together on. But thank you very much to you all, to Laura, for all that you do in our community, really.
So for those of you who are new and may not know Tropical Audubon, I'd like to just take 2 seconds to let you know that we work on conservation issues. We work towards conservation really to protect habitat for wildlife. And if you know Audubon, we're here to protect the migratory pathway through Florida. And we do that through working through education and enjoyment, promoting stewardship. And we work really on Everglades Restoration, Biscayne Bay issues. Those are sort of the hydrologic issues facing us. And bird conservation and growth management. And those kind of go hand in hand because birds need a forested urban environment. And that's why we've picked 4 different areas to focus on today. And you'll notice we have 4 different panels and breakout sessions that are in 4 different areas over lunch. So I hope that you've chosen your favorite area that you'd like to focus on today, because at lunch we will sort of go through a strategy session. What will we do in 2013 to tackle this issue? And a few other sponsors that we have, the Parks and Recreation Department, they have supplied all the microphones that you see here and the whole setup today. Budget Video Rentals is streaming us live right now, and that was all pro bono. Thank you guys, you have done a super job. Whole Foods and the UEL, the Urban Environment League, and Barbara Falsey, the president, Barbara, she has brought us breakfast this morning. And at lunch, you will have the Big Tomato for lunch. So I hope you join us for lunch. And I think that's it. That's enough sponsors. And I will introduce our panel next while Tom sets his laptop up. So our panelists, and forgive me for changing positions here while he puts his laptop up. He's a Mac user. So Tom Van Lent is the senior scientist at the Everglades Foundation, and he is going to be leading off this panel discussion. And then we have Bob Johnson, who is at the National Park Service as the South Florida Natural Resources Center Director. And Doug Yoder, right next to me here, is the Deputy Director of the Miami-Dade County Water and Sewer Department. Did I get that right? That's right. And Megan Tinsley. Megan is with Audubon of Florida. And what's your title, Megan?
Everglades Policy Associate.
Everglades Policy Associate. So welcome our panelists. Give them a round of applause for being here. Okay, you're on.
Okay, thank you, Laura. I'd like to talk about just kind of a Everglades restoration from sort of a 30,000 foot level, and talk about some of the developments in Everglades restoration. But before we get started, I think there's this tendency to always jump into the how to do it. And we oftentimes lose the fundamental question, which is why restore the Everglades? Now, this may seem self-evident to most of us, but believe me, it's not. Of course, the first reason why I might want to restore the Everglades is, of course, the just astounding variety of plants and animals, and as Laura said, that's the very mission of the Tropical Audubon Society. And it seems pretty self-evident to maybe most of us, but it's not a universally held view that this is important. These might be some of the moocher species entitled to food that we've heard so much about recently. But not everyone shares this view, but there are many other reasons to do Everglades restoration. The water you drink. The urban areas of Lower East Coast of South Florida are very dependent on the Everglades for their water supply. The marshes in the Everglades and the outside of the Everglades recharge the aquifer where we get our drinking water from. It's also the source of a great deal of our economic engine. Of course, South Florida, one of the major economic engines is tourism, and the Everglades plays a very important role in our tourist economy. The National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, estimates that we spend about roughly $2 billion a year in just the Central Everglades in terms of direct and indirect economic impact. But the Everglades restoration projects themselves have real benefit. For example, if you look at what the benefits of doing the Everglades restoration project, you'll see that the major benefits occur in real estate and water supply, that cleaning up our water translates into real, measurable difference in property values. Water supply, how much do we pay for water? How much will we pay for more water? The Everglades Foundation commissioned a study that showed that the return on investment, for each dollar I invest in Everglades restoration, the return on investment is 4 to 1. That ranks with the typical Corps of Engineers harbor dredging projects, which may be in the order of 1.9 to 2. Well, environmental restoration like the Everglades will pay twice that, 4 to 1, for a total investment of about $45 billion on our initial $11 billion investment. So that's kind of why, and let's talk about kind of the how a little bit from a very high level. First, there's this description of kind of what happened, why do we have to restore the Everglades, and what do we do? Well, it starts with this picture of how the Everglades used to function as a very slow-moving, broad sheet of water, starting up in Orlando and the upper Kissimmee Lakes, moving into Lake Okeechobee, and then spreading out over the landscape in a vast sheet. Well, we've changed that pretty substantially with the plumbing projects that began around the turn of the century until today we have something that looks nothing like that, really. A little bit of the processes in Everglades National Park, even though they're very damaged, but also a lot of the water that comes from the Kissimmee Basin is channeled, distributed out the estuaries where it causes major damage. So this whole plumbing system we've set in place is causing real damage, polluting water, destroying wildlife habitats, and the idea is how we can fix it. Well, that's the central idea behind the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan. Approved by Congress in 2000, the idea is to kind of put as much as we can back the way it worked before. And the actual elements of this are kind of complicated, so let's zoom in on one of them, which is I'll focus on a project in Collier County called the Picayune Strand Restoration Project. This is a 55,000-acre failed development bought by in the 60s, where we're going to change South Florida into a series of homes. And so they went in and dug canals and built roads. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Well, the idea for restoration is to put water at the top, let it flow, remove the canals, remove the dams, let it flow naturally, and see if that restores the Everglades. Well, and there's a process. The first process you do is you take out all the junk. They remove 600 tons of old buildings and concrete, 40 tons of tires, abandoned tires. Next is to take the roads. I can't really see the screen exactly, so I'm hoping this is kind of synchronized. Take the roads that were there, and what do you do with them? Well, you just rip them up, haul them away. That eliminates those dams, those barriers to flow. Next is you take the canals that channel the water and keep it from the landscape, and you fill those in. How do you do that? Opposite way you did to take it out. You take a dump truck, fill in the hole. It's not exactly rocket science, but a very important step. And when you're done, it looks something like that. It doesn't look like restoration, but here's where time is your ally. When you're done, it might look something like that. It really isn't obvious that this is a restored system, but after a while, it starts to look very different. Within 2 years, the marsh grasses and the water start to grow back. Pretty soon, it becomes looking more and more like a natural marsh. Not exactly, and after several years, you'll see it start to function increasingly like a natural area, and then the kind of coup de grace, you start getting some of the habitat and species recovering in the area that were extirpated, like the panther. That's the sort of 30,000-foot level of restoration. How do you do it? Well, this is how the Corps of Engineers describes it. They sort of have this chart with lots of graphs or lots of little projects, and the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan is this whole system of 68 or so project elements, all which fit together in sort of this very complex system that only a planner or an engineer could really love. But that's the idea of Everglades restoration as it was conceived. And the projects to date, sorry, wrong way. If you look at it, these are kind of, I've just drawn circles around where the projects that are underway. You notice one thing is they all sort of skirt the edge. They're not in the middle of the Central Everglades. And that is a problem if you're trying to do Everglades restoration. Next, the process that Corps came up with has been proven to be way too long, way too expensive, and completely unworkable. That each of these 68 projects sort of relies on other projects to get the benefit, and you have to go and argue for the whole thing before you can get any restoration. And so you're kind of having to delay benefits forever and ever and ever while you argue why Congress should loan you several $billion over the next few years in these difficult economic times. That's just not an easy thing to sell. Also, these delays have been pointed out, have real environmental harms. Time is not on our side. That delay has environmental consequences and progress is urgent. And next, everyone is frustrated with the progress of these projects. From the administration, Congress, the public, we who work in the environmental community are deeply frustrated by the lack of progress. So the idea was to make some changes, and that's this so-called Central Everglades planning process. A couple things to know about this. There's acronyms. We're talking about the government here, so we've got to have an acronym. They call it SEP. One thing, it's SERP. It's Everglades Restoration, just kind of repackaged, hopefully reformed. Next, the focus is on the Central Everglades. That's where the kind of action needs to happen. Next, instead of trying to do 68 individual projects, let's do small parts of a handful of them and try to get a total package that has a real benefit. And next, include everyone. The previous Corps process was the most stilted, unbelievable, complex mess. I, as the public, could not even get questions answered. Like, how big is that pump? I'm sorry, we'll get back to you in a letter. It didn't include the public, in which case anything they do caused a lot of friction. But most importantly, get it done in 18 months. Forget the 7-year process. Cut it down to a year and a half. And we're about 11, 12 months into this, depending on how you count, and that's where we're at. So, and next, the plan, sort of the one endorsed by the environmental groups, I'll just kind of talk about the overarching pieces and why this fits, is clean up the water before you send it to the Everglades. So in the Everglades agricultural area, build something that cleans the water so we're not adding polluted water to the Everglades. Next is spread it out and make it act like sheet flow to the extent you can. So it flows across the landscape kind of in the way it used to, instead of through canals. Spread it out over the marsh. Next, start taking apart these dams that we built in the Everglades that block the water from flowing. We can't exactly take them out all at once, but let's get the process started. Start removing some of the dams, start removing some of the canals, and reconnecting the pieces of the Everglades. And lastly, build Tamiami Trail. That's this major obstacle across the Everglades. We need to get it fixed. The Department of the Interior has a plan to fix it. Let's just do it. That's sort of this is the kind of plan endorsed by almost all the environmental groups, including Tropical Audubon has been one of them who endorsed this plan, helped develop it. This is what we have been articulating as the way forward for Everglades restoration as a first step to get going. And that is the SEP process. So with that, I'll turn it over to the next speaker.
Bob Johnson, you're up next.
Now, I hope you can see it now. Is that right? All right. Like Tom, I'm a hydrologist, so I will be presenting some of the hydrologic aspects of the project. And also, like Tom, I want to take a 30,000-foot level view of the Everglades and talk a little bit about the water management system, the climate of South Florida, sort of how we got ourselves into this mess, and then what we have to do to try to get our way back out. And the things you have to understand is South Florida is a subtropical climate. We're a monsoonal rainfall pattern. We get 80% of our rainfall in the wet season, 20% of our wet rainfall in the dry season, and that's incredibly difficult for water managers to deal with. It's very hard to retain the water in the wet season for the next year's water supply needs, particularly as we've developed half of the Everglades footprint. And so that's the big problem here. The map on the left shows the satellite image of the current system. Look at the big red arrows, because the big red arrows are kind of the story. Those are all the places where we drain water from South Florida to tide in great excess of what happened historically. That's also where we're trying to find the water for both Everglades restoration and for sustainable development in South Florida. Capture water going to tide. What we know so far from looking at climate change predictions is the projections are we're at the latitude of the Sahara Desert, and the projections are it's going to get slightly drier wet season conditions, but punctuated by these more intense and possibly more frequent hurricanes. So imagine you're a water manager and now you have long periods of time, longer than we have now, of low rainfall, and then you have really high rainfall. Again, it's just an incredibly difficult system to manage. And the project that we built, the Central and Southern Florida Flood Control Project, started in the 1940s, is incredibly poor at retaining that water. We've added to it by all moving down here and taking up the footprint of what was the historic Everglades and creating a water demand that I'll talk about. But we discharge about 3.5 million acre-feet a year of water to tide. That's way in excess of what the downstream estuaries need. That's the source of water that we all have to look at for solving this restoration and sustainability problem. And notice in Dade County, the biggest of the red arrows is in Dade County. We have the largest loss to tide in Miami-Dade County versus the other coastal systems. And again, our goal is to figure out how to retain the water. The most promising approaches right now are to capture Lake Okeechobee outflows, which currently go largely to the northern estuaries, and send that water back like it went historically to the Everglades. And then the other thing that we want to look at is all those seepage losses, which are the yellow arrows, where water drains out of the Everglades across what's called the Eastern Protective Levee System into development areas. It causes flooding problems that we have to deal with, and it also makes it so we can't retain the water as we go from one year to the next. So those are probably the most promising areas to look at, and they're very central issues in the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan. So sort of what have we done in the southern part of the system, getting down close to Miami-Dade County? How have we changed the system in basically just one lifetime? So this is a diagram that shows the water depth patterns just to the west of us out in the Everglades. and I'm comparing two wet periods, one in the late 1950s prior to the closure of the water conservation areas and the large impoundments that we have. That's the diagram on the left. The darker blue colors are deeper water depths. The lighter blue colors are shallower water depths. The browns are where it's dry. The dashed lines on the left diagram show where the canals and levees would be going. They're not there yet in 1959. So if you look at that pattern, you can see most of the deep water was over on the eastern side of the Everglades in what we talk about today as Water Conservation Area 3B and Northeast Shark River Slough. All right, about 70% of the flow across Tamiami Trail, which we have records going back to until the 1930s, went across that eastern side, and only 30% went on the western side. Then we built the Central and Southern Florida project. All that water was too close to people, too close to land that we wanted to develop, so we changed the location of where water flows. We moved the river to the west. We built levees enclosing the conservation areas on the south side, and we built levees diagonally across Water Conservation Area 3 and literally shifted the river to the west by about 10 miles along Tamiami Trail. So now the pattern entirely changes. The deep water is over on the west side. We still have to retain it because we need it for water supply, but we want to keep it away from people. So now we pass about 90% of the flow through the western Shark Slough. Goes across areas downstream that are largely marl prairies. We lose it because it very rapidly goes to tide. Doesn't have the benefits to the downstream Everglades within much of Everglades National Park, and it doesn't provide the freshwater flow to Florida Bay in areas where we really need the water. It goes to areas where we don't. And then notice the development on the right diagram. The benefit of all this for us is we lowered the East Everglades, and that allowed development to expand westward. It also lowered water levels in East Everglades and drained that area. I'll mention the East Everglades is an area that Everglades National Park got approval from Congress in 1989 through the ENP Protection and Expansion Act to add to the park. But even before that, Miami-Dade County identified it as an area of critical environmental concern, and they did that for water supply, protection of sustainability back in the 1980s. So if you go into the code from Miami-Dade County and look at section 33B, there's a write-up about areas of critical environmental concern. The East Everglades is one of those. So long before the Park Service and others got involved with trying to protect the area, the citizens of Miami-Dade County saw the value of doing that. It's our water supply. It's what recharges the Biscayne Aquifer and provides us that water. So at the southern part of the system, our goal is make the pattern on the right look more like the pattern on the left. Open up the levees, move more of that water from the western side of the conservation areas back to the eastern side,